Your phone rings, and immediately your heart rate spikes, your stomach tightens. Anxiety floods your system. It doesn't matter who's calling. It doesn't matter if it's expected. That sound, that vibration, that notification triggers something primal in you. Dread, panic, the overwhelming urge to make it stop without actually answering. And while everyone around you seems to casually pick up their phones without a second thought, you're sitting there, frozen, staring at your ringing device like it's a bomb about to explode. Welcome to phone anxiety. And if this is you, you're far from alone. In an age where we have more ways to communicate than ever before, phone calls have become the most dreaded form of contact for a significant portion of the population. And it's not just millennials or Gen Z, though they're often blamed for killing phone culture. It's people across all demographics who've developed this intense aversion to synchronous voice communication. And there are real psychological reasons why. Let's start with the most obvious one. Phone calls are intrusive. They demand immediate attention and response. When someone calls you, they're essentially saying, "Drop whatever you're doing right now and talk to me." And in a world where we're already overwhelmed, overstimulated, and stretched thin, that demand feels aggressive. It feels entitled, because it assumes that your time, your focus, your mental energy is available on demand. And for many people, especially those with anxiety, ADHD, or trauma histories, that assumption is violating. Think about it. A text message you can respond to when you're ready. An email gives you even more time. A voice message lets you process information before formulating a response. But a phone call requires you to be immediately present, immediately articulate, immediately socially competent. There's no time to think, no time to edit, no time to prepare. You have to perform in real time. And for people who struggle with verbal processing, social anxiety, or simply not time to organize their thoughts, that real-time demand is paralyzing. Then there's the issue of unpredictability. When you receive a text, you know what it says before you have to respond. But a phone call is a mystery. You don't know what the person wants. You don't know how long it will take. You don't know if it's good news or bad news. You don't know if it's a quick question or a half-hour conversation. That uncertainty creates anxiety. And for people who need structure and predictability to feel safe, phone calls represent chaos, an unknown variable they can't prepare for or control. And let's talk about the performance aspect. Phone calls require you to perform a specific social role. You have to use your phone voice. That slightly higher, more pleasant, more professional tone that's not quite your real voice. You have to follow social scripts, the greetings, the small talk, the transitions, the polite closings, and you have to monitor yourself constantly. Are you talking too much? Not enough? Are you being interesting? Are you being boring? Did that joke land? Should you have said that differently? It's exhausting. Every phone call becomes a social performance that requires energy many people simply don't have. There's also the issue of missing social cues. In person, you have body language, facial expressions, gestures, eye contact. You can see when someone's about to speak. You can gauge their emotional state. You can tell if they're engaged or distracted. But on a phone call, all of that disappears. You're navigating a conversation blind, and that makes it harder to communicate effectively. You talk over each other. You misread tone. You can't tell if a silence is comfortable or awkward. And for people who already struggle with social interaction, removing those visual cues makes an already difficult task nearly impossible. For people with social anxiety, phone calls are particularly torturous. because there's no escape. In a text conversation, if you need a break, you can just not respond immediately. But on a phone call, you're trapped. You can't just hang up without it being weird. You can't take a 5-minute break to calm down. You're locked into this interaction until it naturally ends. And knowing you're trapped intensifies the anxiety. Your fight or flight response kicks in, but you can't fight and you can't flee. So you freeze. And that freeze response makes the whole interaction even more difficult. There's also the issue of time. Phone calls are time thieves. A text conversation happens in fragments across hours or days. You respond when you can. But a phone call demands continuous, uninterrupted time. And in our busy, fragmented lives, that kind of sustained attention feels like a luxury most people can't afford. When someone calls, they're not just asking for information. They're asking for a chunk of your finite time and attention. And that ask feels increasingly unreasonable in a world where both are scarce resources. And let's address the elephant in the room. For many people, especially younger generations, phone calls feel outdated, inefficient. There are faster, easier, less intrusive ways to communicate. Why call when you can text? Why have a synchronous conversation when asynchronous communication allows both parties to respond at their convenience? The technology has evolved, but social expectations haven't caught up, and that disconnect creates conflict and anxiety. Then there's the issue of boundary violations. When someone calls without warning, it feels like they're crossing a boundary. They're assuming access to you. And in a culture where boundaries are increasingly recognized as important for mental health, that assumption of access feels entitled. Especially for people who've had their boundaries violated in other ways, unexpected phone calls can trigger trauma responses. That ring isn't just annoying, it's a reminder that your space, your time, your autonomy isn't entirely your own. For people with ADHD or executive function challenges, phone calls present a unique set of problems. They interrupt focus. And for someone with ADHD, getting back into a state of hyperfocus after an interruption can be nearly impossible. That phone call doesn't just take 5 minutes. It destroys the entire productive period. Plus, phone calls require sustained attention and working memory. You have to track the conversation in real time, remember what was said, formulate responses, and stay engaged. For ADHD brains, that's depleting multiple executive functions simultaneously. No wonder it feels overwhelming. There's also the sensory component. For people with sensory processing issues or autism, phone calls can be genuinely painful. The sound quality is often poor. There's static, compression, echoes. People's voices sound different on the phone. And processing auditory information without visual support is significantly harder for many neurodivergent people. Add in the unpredictability, the social demands, and the lack of clear structure, and phone calls become a sensory and cognitive nightmare. Let's talk about voicemail. Because if phone calls are bad, voicemail is worse. Now you have to leave a message, perform a monologue with no feedback, and you can't edit. You can't backspace and rephrase. If you stumble over words, if you forget what you were saying, if you ramble, that's what gets recorded. And then you spend the rest of the day cringing about it, wondering if you sounded stupid, wishing you could delete it and start over. It's all the anxiety of a phone call plus the permanent record of your awkwardness. And here's something interesting. Phone anxiety isn't always about the phone itself. Often it's about what the phone represents. For some people, calls from certain people trigger anxiety because those relationships are complicated. A call from a parent who's critical, A call from a boss who only contacts you when there's a problem. A call from a friend who talks endlessly without letting you off the phone. The phone becomes associated with those negative experiences, and over time, all phone calls start triggering that same anxiety, even when they're from safe people. There's also generational and cultural context. Older generations grew up with phone calls as the primary form of distance communication. For them, calling is normal, expected, efficient. But younger generations grew up with text, email, social media. For them, calling feels intrusive, outdated, reserved for emergencies or very close relationships. Neither perspective is wrong, but when they collide, it creates misunderstanding and judgment. Older people think younger people are rude for not answering. Younger people think older people are inconsiderate for calling without warning. And let's address the productivity culture angle. We're told to be available, to be responsive, to never miss an opportunity. And phone calls exploit that anxiety. What if it's important? What if someone needs you? What if not answering costs you something? So people who hate phone calls often answer anyway, despite the anxiety, because they've been conditioned to believe that unavailability equals failure, and that forced availability is exhausting. But here's what's important to understand. Phone anxiety is valid. It's not laziness. It's not rudeness. It's not being antisocial. It's a genuine psychological response to a form of communication that, for various reasons, feels overwhelming, intrusive, or unsafe, and recognizing that validity is the first step toward managing it. So what do you do if you hate phone calls? First, you accept it. Stop judging yourself for it. Stop trying to force yourself to be someone who casually takes calls without anxiety. That person might not be you, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with having communication preferences, nothing wrong with needing different methods of connection than what previous generations used. Second, set boundaries. Let people know you prefer text or email. Put it in your email signature if you need to. Tell friends and family that you need advance notice for calls. Ask people to text first to ask if you're available. These aren't unreasonable requests. They're accommodations for how your brain works, and people who care about you will respect them. Third, recognize when phone calls are necessary and prepare for them. Some things genuinely need to be handled by phone. Doctor appointments, important work conversations, emergencies. When you know you have to make a call, schedule it. Put it on your calendar. Give yourself prep time. Write down what you need to say. Give yourself permission to take breaks if needed. Treat it like the task it is, not some casual thing you should be able to do effortlessly. Fourth, practice exposure gradually. If phone anxiety is significantly impacting your life, consider gradual exposure. Start with low-stakes calls, ordering food, calling a store to check hours. Work your way up. Exposure therapy works, but it has to be at your pace, with your consent, with support, not forced by others who don't understand. Fifth, explore the root cause. Is it social anxiety, ADHD, sensory issues, trauma? Understanding why phone calls trigger you helps you address the underlying issue. Therapy can be incredibly valuable here, particularly therapists who understand neurodivergence, anxiety disorders, and trauma. And finally, advocate for alternative communication methods becoming normalized. The more people who speak up about preferring text, email, or scheduled calls, the more those preferences become accepted. This isn't just a personal issue, it's a cultural shift. And cultural shifts happen when enough people say, "This doesn't work for me. We need other options." It's also worth recognizing that phone call culture is already changing. Many businesses now offer chat, support, online booking, email contact. Dating apps have built-in messaging, so you don't have to exchange numbers early. Work culture is slowly accepting that not everyone needs to be available by phone at all times. The world is catching up to what phone-anxious people have known all along. Synchronous communication isn't always the best option, but we're not there yet. And in the meantime, people who hate phone calls are still navigating a world that often demands them, still feeling judged for their preferences, still forcing themselves through anxiety-inducing conversations because they don't feel they have a choice. And that needs to be acknowledged, because the psychological toll of constantly overriding your own needs, of forcing yourself into situations that trigger anxiety, is significant. So to everyone who hates phone calls, who lets their phone ring, who feels relief when it goes to voicemail, who texts instead of calling whenever possible, who needs 3 business days to work up to making a phone call, you're not broken. You're not antisocial. You're not lazy. You're someone whose communication needs don't align with the dominant culture. And that's valid. Your boundaries are valid. Your preferences are valid. Your anxiety is valid. And to everyone who doesn't understand phone anxiety, who thinks people should just answer their phones, who judges people for preferring text, consider that not everyone's brain works the same way. That what's easy for you might be genuinely difficult for someone else. That insisting everyone communicate the way you prefer is actually the inconsiderate position. That true connection happens when we respect each other's needs, not when we force everyone into the same mold. The psychology of people who hate phone calls is complex. It's about anxiety, boundaries, neurodivergence, sensory processing, generational differences, and cultural shifts. It's not one thing. It's many things intersecting. And for each person, the specific reasons and triggers will be different. But what's universal is the experience of feeling misunderstood, of being judged for something that feels overwhelming to you, but easy to others, of having to constantly justify why you need what you need. So maybe we need a new social contract around phone calls, one where calling without warning is considered rude, not the other way around, where texting first to ask if someone's available is standard practice, where respecting someone's communication preferences is more important than maintaining outdated norms, where we recognize that connection can happen in many forms, and none is inherently superior to others. Because at the end of the day, communication is supposed to facilitate connection. But when the method of communication creates anxiety, overwhelm, and distress, it's not connecting, it's disconnecting. And maybe it's time we prioritized people's well-being over tradition. Time we created space for different communication styles to coexist without judgment. If you hate phone calls, you deserve to navigate the world in a way that doesn't constantly trigger your anxiety. You deserve relationships where your boundaries are respected. You deserve to communicate in ways that work for your brain. And you deserve to stop feeling guilty about it. Your phone doesn't own you. You own your phone. And you get to decide how, when, and whether to answer it.